Here's a story that will mystify some, and some it won't. I call it The Lights That Warned Us. In June 1953, engineer A. Newton of Bloomington, Indiana, was at the throttle of train number 72 as it approached a section of track north of McDowell, Indiana, over which trains ran on the block warning system. With him in the cab were A.E. Jeffard, fireman, and Clifford Birch, brakeman. Now, Newton saw that the lights of the first block showed yellow, which meant caution. As he proceeded at a safe speed of 20 miles per hour, he found that every block showed yellow. He and the other two men figured that they were running on another train's block, or the tracks had been buckled by the hot weather, as so often had happened. Number 72 was rounding a sharp curve when suddenly Jeffard and Birch shouted for Newton to stop. Two small children were sitting between the tracks directly in front of the engine. Had Newton been running at the usual speed of 40 miles per hour instead of 20, he could never have stopped in time to save the children. A careful investigation after Newton reported the incident showed the block system and the tracks to be in perfect order. Nobody could understand what made all the blocks show yellow when they should have showed green or all clear. But Engineer Newton felt a divine hand was responsible. The story of the person whose picture could not be taken, of unemployment, got a job in March 1949 crewing ships. In interviewing the men, he got to know one of them very well. Now, Donald was young, blond, slender, and below medium height. He laughed often, but never with his eyes. They seemed strangers to the rest of his body. His glib tongue made him the best of companions. One evening, the three of us were sitting and talking when I offered to take Donald's picture.
You can't take a picture of me. Nobody can.
We accused him of telling a tall yarn, but he turned serious. All right, he said quietly, his eyes distant again.
I am telling you the truth. There will be nothing on the film.
Well, now, this nettled me a bit, as I rather pride myself on my photographic ability. Carefully, I checked the light and the camera. It should be perfect, I thought, as I clicked the shutter. Then I took a shot of my husband, seated in the same chair and under the same lighting. Just to be safe, I said, I'll take another one of you, Don, and clicked the shutter again. There, I said smugly. Donald smiled with his lips. When I picked up the pictures 2 weeks later, the clerk told me 2 of the pictures didn't come out. Opening the envelope, I found that the picture of my husband was perfect. But the 2 of Donald had not been printed. The negatives were blank. Looks as though you forgot to take these 2, remarked the clerk, examining them. Well, Donald seemed to avoid us after that. But why, out of the hundreds of pictures I've taken, have only those two been absolutely blank when they were developed? I was 15 years old in 1933 when my parents moved to a farm near Pikesville, Kentucky. 6 acres of level land below the house was covered with a species of broom grass, commonly called broom sage. It grew to a height of 2 or 3 feet, and in the autumn it became brown and very dry. I often played in the broom sage, and Dad always warned me never to carry matches, for fear I might accidentally set fire to it. One sunny, windy day in March, I went into the broom sage to play, and a voice spoke to me. It said,
"Don't go in there, boy. Don't go in there."
I looked around and saw no one. I went back into the house where Mom was seated before the big wood fire in the living room, crocheting. I told her about the voice. She said she hadn't been outside for over an hour. I returned to the field, thinking nothing more about the voice, and started running toward the opposite end. The same voice spoke and said,
"Get out of here quick, boy. Get out of here."
I didn't know what to do. I was scared. Then I smelled smoke and saw flames leaping through the broom sage, fanned by a heavy wind. "Start running, you can beat it," the voice warned me. I ran, and the flames were so close that I felt the heat on my back. The smoke almost smothered me, but I made it out of the field. The only explanation for the fire was offered by Dad. He said it must have been started by sparks from the chimney of the house. But I have no explanation for the warning voice. I will call this the affair of the SS Watertown. The crewmen of the tanker reported a weird phenomenon after their 2 dead shipmates had been buried at sea. The memorial service was over. The boards were tilted across the rail of the SS Watertown, and the bodies of James Courtney and Michael Meehan were consigned to their watery grave. The 2 men had died of the effects of gas fumes, and the burial at sea took place at latitude 14-20 north, longitude 50 west. The ship continued on, bound for the Panama Canal. The tragic incident should not have been closed, and it was not. The bodies of the 2 crewmen had been buried on December 4, 1954. On January 9, 1955, one of the gasoline tanker's crew, a worried expression on his face, approached the captain. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, "but we, the crew, that is, don't like what's going on." "And what might be that?" demanded Captain Keith Tracy. "Courtney and Meehan, sir," was the reply. "They ain't dead. They're following the ship." The skipper looked suspiciously at the man. Then he said, "You been drinking, sailor?" "So help me, sir," the seaman raised his hand solemnly. "It ain't only me that's seen 'em. All the men has, every evening at twilight. We see 'em swimming alongside about 8 feet off the port rail." Captain Tracy laughed. But when the spokesman's shipmates confirmed the statement, he said, "Very well, let's all go have a look." Well, they went. They looked. And then the skipper asked for a camera. A camera was obtained. Pictures were taken of the spot, and both camera and film were locked in the ship's safe. After the vessel had passed through the Panama Canal and put in at Colon, the film was taken to a photographer who knew nothing of the affair. When the film was developed, one of the negatives bore the faint image of two heads. To a man, the crew of the SS Watertown swore that the faces were those of their dead crewmates, Courtney and Meehan. The facts of this case were sworn to by Monroe Atkins, assistant engineer of the gasoline tanker, and by the skipper, Keith Tracy. They were checked and verified by the Burns Detective Agency. The photographs were pronounced genuine. They had not been tampered with. Those pictures are now owned by the Henry L. Doherty Company. What's the answer? Well, it's one of those things that baffle the finest scientific brains, and which are more easily forgotten than explained. Now, in this next story, I would like to point out that it is going to take more than radar to trap a ghost. What? You don't think so? Well, here is how this happened. A few minutes after midnight, on November 23rd, 1952, the Associated Press reports 5 British ghost hunters set up shop to see what they could track down by way of electronics. They chose the cobwebbed hall of a 200-year-old haunted house at Hove, England, along the Channel coast. The Hove Ghost has reputedly moved paint pots, ornaments, and other gadgets through locked doors. No one has been willing to rent Hove Mansion for 20 years. And 3 caretakers have been frightened out by the strange goings-on. Its favorite haunt has been a rickety passageway where the 5 ghost hunters set up their electronic equipment. They installed a radar set in the passageway. Ted Henty taped doors and keyholes and flanked the radar machine with cotton threads tacked to adjoining walls. Bruce Copen got out an electric magnetic pendulum, and this is what happened. At 12:15, the radar screen came alive. Images began to dance across it. One of the 5 men took a photograph of the corridor with flash equipment. But nothing could be seen in the gloom. Meanwhile, the screen continued to register. A few minutes later, there was a creak, then a noise like a cough and a shuffle of feet. The radar set went out, and there was a loud noise. At 12:35, the ghost hunters turned on the lights. They could see nothing, and the ghost traps were not visibly disturbed. Now, here's a story you folks will enjoy if you like fortune-telling. During a trip to South Africa in 1955, Isidore Arnold Berger, a Detroit, Michigan attorney, had a startling experience with the witch doctors of East Transvaal. Hearing that the witch doctors claimed to be able to tell fortunes by means of dollars or bones, Berger decided to investigate. He consulted a witch doctor at Kruger Park. With him was an acquaintance, Roy Smith of Nels Pruitt, who took photographs as the witch doctor threw his dollars and gave a reading which was taken down by a tape recorder. Among other things, the witch doctor told Berger that his wife at home in Detroit had been ill but now was better, and that his sister had returned to her father's home. 2 days later, Berger and Smith consulted another witch doctor at Bushrock Ridge. Although 100 miles from the first, the second witch doctor gave Berger an almost identical reading. One of the matters he mentioned was that Berger's wife had been seriously ill. He added that Berger soon would hear of a death in his family. In Nels Pruitt that night, Berger checked on the readings by phoning his wife in Detroit. Mrs. Berger answered the phone and said, yes, she had been ill with flu, but now felt fine. Yes, Berger's sister had returned to her father's home. Berger then asked the question that he felt would clinch whether or not there were any significance to the fortune-telling ability of the witch doctors. Had anyone in the family died? Mrs. Berger said yes. Berger's pet dog. The animal had passed away from old age. This is Tom ONeil with the story of a little mountain donkey who helped save 4 lives. Now, this all happened during the filming of a motion picture 12,000 feet up in the Bernese Alps. During the shooting, one of those sudden snowstorms separated the star, Elaine Stewart, and 3 other members of the company from the main party. But no matter. Their little mountain donkey, who knew the way, was leading them back, when suddenly he stopped and refused to go any further. All of a sudden, out of the storm came a figure in a bright red jacket, shouting a warning for them not to move from where they were. Then he vanished, and 4 scared people just waited and wondered. A short time later, guides arrived and led them to safety past a hidden, bottomless crevice into which they would have plunged had they gone forward. When they all got back and related their story, they learned that several months before, a red-jacketed climber had fallen to his death in that very same crevice. Oh, yes. The name of the picture they were shooting? High Hell. The parish magazine of St. Luke's Church, Chelsea, tells of an artist who, after being employed to retouch a church painting, had his bill returned with a request that full details of the work should be specified. This is a selection from the account he then presented. Brightening up the flames of hell, putting new tail on devil, mending his hood, and doing several odd jobs for the damned, 12 shillings. Embellishing Pontius Pilate and putting new ribbons on his hat, 8 shillings. Repluming and regilding left wing of Angel Gabriel, 6 shillings. Washing high priest's servants, 5 shillings. Cleaning out St. David's ears, 2 shillings. Renewing heaven, adjusting the stars, and cleaning up the moon, 7 shillings. Total, 40 shillings. Please remit.
Here's a most unusual story of a doctor who had the most mystifying experience of his life.
The good doctor was awakened during the night by a person who insisted on his going immediately to a lonely house where a young woman was dangerously ill. In a well-furnished room on the first floor of the house, he found this young woman evidently in great suffering. After examining her, the doctor made out a prescription and gave it to the person who had called him. The next morning, the doctor called at the house, but could get no reply. However, a gardener working nearby told him that the house had not been occupied for 10 years. The doctor refused to believe the gardener, who, in order to convince him, got the keys of the house and led the doctor inside. The house was empty and thick with dust. Bewildered, he gazed around, and suddenly his eye was attracted by a piece of paper on the floor. It was the prescription he had made out the night before. Now, there is a theory to this affair. Had the doctor, overworked, been the subject of an extraordinary case of sleepwalking, but granted that he was walking in his sleep, how did he gain entry into the house, which was barred and bolted?
Here is the strange tale of a woman
who acted on information conveyed to her in a dream. This lady, Mrs. Kendall, had the remarkable experience of recovering a family heirloom which had been lost for 20 years. In 1937, Mrs. Kendall and some friends were picnicking in the woods when she lost a handsome diamond brooch. All efforts to find the brooch failed. Then, 20 years later, she dreamed for 2 nights in a row that she had returned to the spot where the picnic was held, and there on the ground was the missing brooch. Being somewhat superstitious, Mrs. Kendall determined to put her dream to a test. And though her friends were naturally skeptical, they accompanied her on her quest. 20 years had made very little difference in the terrain, and Mrs. Kendall, while poking among some rocks, suddenly dislodged a stone. And there stood revealed the lost heirloom. It was practically intact. Once before, this lucky lady found her dreams to be prophetic. 12 months ago, she dreamed that she would inherit money, and sure enough, a cousin died in Kentucky and left her $600. This certainly sounds like one of those dream-as-you-go plans. Here's the story of a German doctor who has patented a clock to induce sleep. It makes a soft, humming, monotonous sound for about 40 minutes, and then gradually fades away. I wonder how many of you ladies have husbands who can do the same thing. Here is a report on poltergeist activities that took place in a small hamlet in the south of France. This activity was associated with a young boy who had come from his home in Marseille to visit his grandmother. The manifestations were said to be quite alarming, and while all of the commotion lasted, the boy would be in a sound sleep. About 9 o'clock one evening, Granny was disturbed by frightening cries coming from the boy. So she called in some neighbors. They found Granny collapsed in a chair. The boy was still fast asleep, and flying in all directions were forks, knives, spoons, glasses, and even some newly washed linen. All joining in a wild saraband of a dance. There was an elegance in their movements as they flew around without ever touching one another. Suddenly, an oil lamp went out, but it was mysteriously relit, whereupon it also joined in the festivity. rising in the air, passing through the doorway, and one of the neighbors decided that he would hunt for some hidden intruder who might be playing tricks. So he ventured in among these items that were flying around the room. His reward was to have a heavy soup spoon hit him on top of the head. Well, under this barrage of flying silverware, table napkins, and freshly washed laundry, a few of the braver neighbors managed with difficulty to awaken the boy, who wanted to know what all the fuss was about. Only then did the cutlery, crockery, and all of the other material that was flying around the room settle back to their normal positions. Later, a psychiatrist examined the boy and said that he was not obsessed, and a doctor said that he was not sick. Nevertheless, Granny and the neighbors were convinced the youngster was the innocent cause of the trouble, so his parents were sent for to take him home. And as last reports have it, whenever this boy falls into a special sort of deep sleep, all the small items in that room will rise from their places and go gallivanting. A recent issue of a military magazine, with sardonic humor, prints the following. Quote, a discipline order, subject, dying. It has been brought to the notice of headquarters that men have been dying without prior consent of their superior officer. This practice will cease immediately. There will be no overtaking on the route to heaven. Any officer passed on the way will be paid the usual compliments. He will draw on arrival the following supplies: 1 brass harp, 1 cloud, fleecy, 1 pair of wings. Harps will be clean, bright, and highly strung. Wings will be covered with flickering stardust. Clouds will be checked for condensation and refilled with antifreeze as and when necessary. Victims will parade 1 hour after arrival for halo fitting. Dress loose order, wings at the glide, harps at the port. Here is an unusual story called Travelling by Levitation. The Sunday Pictorial, London, England, calls Richard Church, the distinguished author, Mr. Fly by Day. They quote Church as saying, "From the age of 10, I had this strange power to rise 6 or 7 feet from the ground and fly through the air like an owl. This always happened whenever I got excited or put out about anything. I would rise above my difficulties and soar through the air." He seemed to move only a little faster than the people below him. On one occasion, he overstayed his time talking to a friend and feared he would miss his train at Victoria. This fear put me in an agitation that heated my blood,
I began to sweat, and finally could no longer walk towards the bus stop. I drew a deep breath and rose from the pavement of Great Russell Street, thus avoiding the crowded street. I reached Victoria with a quarter of an hour to spare, exhausted and still sweating. He says, quote, I must be invisible when I am flying because even when I used to float down the stairs during my time in the civil service, no one ever saw me. He always flew alone and gave up the practice when he was 29. Here is a story from Malaya that has to do with haunting soldiers. And the Singapore reporter of the Sunday Express says that frightened workmen are pulling down a girls' school which is haunted by British soldiers who were beheaded by Japanese in wartime. The school is in central Malaya and had 300 girl pupils, ages 12 to 20. Teachers reported that the girls fell into trance, declaiming English poetry, a favorite being Keats' Ode to Aggression Urn. Yet, none of the girls speak English. The girls felt compelled to march and countermarch. As though on parade, they became so strong that they tore planks apart with their bare hands. Some girls had an overwhelming desire for roast beef, jelly, and custard. These group attacks might last 5 hours. As soon as the girls were taken out of the building, they recovered. After 3 days, murmuring prayers and incantations, begging the spirits to leave the girls alone, witch doctors admitted defeat, saying that the spirits roared with anger when asked to leave the building. Malayans used to bring offerings of food to appease the spirits. Eventually, the authorities condemned the building. Here are a few stories of accurate foretellings, called Premonitions. But first, there are so many examples of precognition, foreknowledge, and foreboding that few responsible scientists would deny that ESP, or just old-fashioned telepathy, was slowly emerging from the age-old taboo of black magic. Now here's a story of a 14-year-old boy traveling by rail insisted that something is going to happen. I feel it in my bones. The train is going too fast. Well, the train jumped the rails, and the boy was crushed to death. Then one about a dream in which this person had been at a fair. A man rushed past, seized a rifle from the shooting booth, and shot himself. He mentioned this to his fiancée. Next day they read that a man had shot himself with a gun stolen from a miniature rifle range at the fair. And this one is about a woman who was disturbed by a voice repeating, "Paris calling." At breakfast, she mentioned it to her husband and dismissed it. At 1 p.m., Paris calling, but it was a wrong number. And this dream, that this person saw a headline, quote, plane crash, 34 lost, end quote. Next morning he heard a news bulletin announcing that 33 people had died at the airport. He rushed out to buy a newspaper. The plane had hit a house, and a boy in it was killed. Total, 34. This story has to do with a whole crowd seeing a ghost. And relates that a 13th century ghost was seen simultaneously by hundreds of people in broad daylight in a 13th century house. After being empty for many years, it was refurnished in 1932 with an air of pageantry, and a large crowd gathered to watch. When at the climax of the ceremony, the city horn was blown outside the old house, the crowd gasped on seeing a figure in a strange period costume looking through a window in one of the empty rooms. Many were questioned, their descriptions of the figure tallying, from which it was established that the apparition had been wearing 13th century attire. A local historian found a painting of Hugh Ripley, the first to live in the house, showing him dressed and looking exactly as hundreds had seen him.
Now, Martha Martin and her husband, Don, were prospecting near a lonely strip of Alaska coast when Don disappeared. He had set out across the bay one morning in a small boat to meet the mail steamer. The severe Alaskan winter was closing in, and while he was gone, a sudden storm came up. Now, Martha was deeply concerned over her husband's being caught by the storm in his small boat. And to keep her mind off her worries, she decided when the storm ended to go to the mine to pick up an ore specimen which she and Don had unearthed. But in the meantime, the storm was getting much worse. Now, the mine was situated on the slope of a canyon, a deep canyon, and Martha made her way there with difficulty. She found herself inside the cave. She located the ore specimen, and on her way back with it, noticed that a barrel had been left full of water, and realized it would burst when it froze during the winter. As she stopped to empty the barrel, she heard a crackling and tearing sound from the slope right above her. At the same time, she heard a shout of warning from a voice which she recognized as Don's. She leaped forward, an action which saved her life, for an instant later, this landslide roared over her. She was battered into unconsciousness by the deluge of rocks and earth. When she came to, she found herself hanging over the precipitous canyon.
Be very careful. Be very careful.
She was supported by the rifle sling over her shoulder, which had become entangled in a bush.
Be careful. I'm helping.
She discovered that she had a broken arm and other injuries. As she struggled to free herself, handicapped by her broken arm, she again heard Don's voice.
Be careful, sweetheart. Go that way. Go that way.
It directed her, encouraged her, and with its guidance, she freed herself from the rifle sling and climbed laboriously up the slope.
Take it easy. Take it easy.
She climbed slowly, dazed with pain from her injuries. All the time, her husband's voice coaxed and pleaded with her to keep moving.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Finally, she reached the safety of the canyon trail and there fell into an exhausted sleep.
Rest easy, baby.
Her husband's voice woke her and urged her along the trail until she was out of the canyon.
That's the way.
Then she heard his voice no more.
My sweetheart. Goodbye.
She knew, she says, that Don was not present at the time she heard his voice. But she is certain that she did hear him, for she feels she could not be deluded as to the sound of her own husband's voice. However, the last time she saw him was when he set out into the bay in his small boat